The purpose of this is to reflect on my work, showcase my accomplishments, and inspire other developers. I'm Paul Avalone, and I make games. I worked on Please Don't Touch Anything Housebroken, which is a sequel to Please Don't Touch Anything. One of the main reasons so much time and effort was put into Update 2.2 for the Quest 2 version of Please Don't Touch Anything was that Forward XP wanted to continue the series in some way. I even hid an Easter egg teasing this. Originally conceptualized as a potential port to other VR platforms with a few additional endings, over time it grew and solidified into a mixed reality sequel. What is mixed reality? Well, virtual reality, or VR, is when you are in an immersive environment that is entirely digital. Augmented reality, or AR, is when digital elements are overlaid on top of your real environment, but they don't interact with each other. Mixed reality, or MR, is a mixture of both VR and AR, where digital and real-world objects and environments can interact with each other. The project was codenamed PDTA-MR. I was tasked with researching the current capabilities of mixed reality on the Quest 2 and Quest Pro, and how we would make the game for the then unannounced Quest 3. Meta's MR was in its infancy when I started investigating this on October 26, 2022, so there were scarcely any examples to test out in their experimental app lab. I know the exact date because Shell Games' free MR demonstration, I Expect You to Die, Home Sweet Home, had literally just come out the day before, which was convenient timing for me. I played the game repeatedly and experimented by testing the limitations of the room setup. I also thoroughly did the same with Meta's own MR experience, The World Beyond, where there I also tested out hand tracking. I compiled into a detailed document the limitations of Meta's room scale and how those two short MR experiences used it. Like most early adopters, they weren't perfect, but they had impressive potential. There were choices they made in their design that I thought were clever, and there were others I thought could be improved upon. I broke down exactly how we could go about making a Please Don't Touch Anything game in MR, what were the best practices, and what pitfalls to avoid. Additionally, I documented my small MR tests in both Unreal Engine and Unity to help determine which engine we would use. The previous game was made in Unity, but we were starting from scratch. Unreal's MR support was slightly delayed compared to Unity's, but there was a minimal difference between the two. When the team was formed, most of us, including me, wanted to use Unreal, so that's what we went with. Early on in the project, it was just the lead engineer and I prototyping the basic MR elements of the game. It's not an easy feat making an escape room where the room can be any shape and size within reason. One of the first things I did was figure out what dimensions the console should be. There were several parameters to keep in mind when determining the best fit. I couldn't adjust player height like in VR, so it needed to be comfortable both sitting and standing for the widest possible range of people. The minimum meta room scale requirements were 6.5 feet by 6.5 feet, or 2 meters by 2 meters, with 4 walls. The maximum meta room scale limits were 50 feet by 50 feet, or 15 meters by 15 meters, with 10 plus walls. Also, the unknown amount of objects like couches, tables, desks, etc. that the player could have in their room. So I got out a tape measure and experimented. I made it as small and comfortable as possible so that it didn't take up too much room and that you didn't have to strain to reach things, but also large enough that we could fit the puzzles on it. It was helped by the fact that the puzzles weren't always visible and that different interactions could pop up out of the same location at different times. VR development has its own set of complications, but there are a lot of extra little things you don't realize when it comes to MR. Originally the console was flush with the floor, but I noticed that when I stood in front of it, my feet clipped into it. It was immersion breaking, so I asked one of the artists to give the console legs. So now when you stand in front of it and your feet go slightly under the console, the player never even thinks about it. There was a lot of iteration on where the screen should go. We discussed having it on one of your walls, but if the player's walls were far away, or it didn't have a ton of open space, it would look bad. For a long time, the screen was very large and attached to the console like the previous game. The problem we realized was that it blocked a lot of your view of your real environment, and we wanted you to look around your room when cool effects happened, not at the screen. Also, if you weren't looking at the screen to look around your room, then there was no point in putting a ton of effort into the ending screen animations from the previous games. Because of these issues, there was talks of removing the screen entirely. I pointed out that doing this would remove the context of the city and what was happening in a lot of the endings. A core element of the series was that interacting with this little console had catastrophic consequences. We settled on a middle ground where we drastically shrunk the screen into a tiny monitor and had it so the screen was static, before showing a still image of the destroyed city. Development of the shelf went through similar iterations. We added a shelf because we needed more places to put puzzle clues. We discussed having a shelf attached to a wall, but were worried about players accidentally punching their own real walls. We attempted 2 tiny shelves attached to the sides of the console, but it was too bulky and top-heavy looking. We settled on a standalone shelf, but made sure it was very open so it blocked as little of your room view as possible. In the previous game, when you completed an ending, you were rewarded with a poster to put on your wall. For this game, we discussed being able to place posters wherever you wanted in your room. That had a few too many complications, so we were going to have a corkboard on the wall that you would place them on instead. In the end, we settled on having them all be stickers that you stuck on the console like how some of them were in the original 2D game. This had them constantly in the player's line of sight and allowed us to avoid more wall usage. Early on in development, together as a team, we brainstormed a ton of different interactables, puzzles, and endings. I came up with 4 scenarios for a successful immersive MR experience. Each ending needed to follow at least one or more of these. 1. Something virtual from the virtual world extends into your real room space. 2. Something virtual in your real room space extends into the virtual world. 3. NPC interacts with you in your real room space. 4. Your real room space is visually altered or distorted. We went all out and came up with more stuff than we knew we could fit in the game. In design, it's always easier to just throw everything out than cherry-pick the ideas with promise. We tweaked and scoped them down as necessary. It was important to me that the puzzles didn't have red herrings, and that if we were doing an ending that was similar to the previous game, it needed to be different enough to warrant its inclusion. It was a sequel and not another remake. We needed to have the game work with hand tracking and controllers, so it limited the interactions we could have. With the controller, you can press a button to make a drill go or scissors cut, but with hand tracking, you can only poke, grab, and pick up objects. From our chosen ideas, we picked a handful of puzzle mechanics and one ending to make a vertical slice. A vertical slice is when you fully develop and polish only a small sliver of a project to give a good representation of what the whole project would be if the rest of the content were to be fully fleshed out and implemented. The alien abduction ending was chosen as our vertical slice, so it received more development time than any of the other endings. It also allowed us to iron out the wrinkles and gave us valuable intel on determining the best process to develop the rest of the game. Aside from contributing heavily to design, I programmed and implemented several puzzle interactions and endings. As a team, we participated in regular playtests and feedback sessions to make the game the best it could be. Because the previous games are so beloved, there was a lot of pressure to live up to that standard and get it right. It's a major relief that from the reviews, it seems like we succeeded. Like most game developers, not everything I wanted to be in the game made it in, but I'm very proud of just how much of the game is what it is because I worked on it.